Ask any reasonably literate person who was Leo Tolstoy, and the response will be author of War and Peace. Few will have learned that Tolstoy had tried to save his country from violent upheaval by solving what political economists and moral philosophers called the land question. These insights came to Tolstoy late in life, although his intellectual and moral commitment to improving the human condition began much earlier. In 1861, he traveled to Brussels, where he met with the mutualist philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Tolstoy biographer Henry Troyat describes what occurred. Proudhon was just completing a philosophical work on armed conflict between nations, War and Peace. Tolstoy was struck by the title and it remained engraved in his memory. Proudhon inquired of Tolstoy about the conditions in Russia. Following Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, Tsar Alexander II had seized upon the opportunity to move Russia toward modernization. Land reform was, he believed, essential if Russia was to become a modern state. To the nobility, he declared, "The existing condition of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to begin to destroy serfdom from above than to wait until that time when it begins to destroy itself from below. I ask you, gentlemen, to figure out how all this can be carried out to completion." Impressive though the new freedoms first looked, it soon became apparent that they had come at a heavy cost for the peasants. It was not they, but the landlords who were the real beneficiaries. One should not be surprised that the compensation that the landowners received was far greater than the true value of the land taken. Moreover, they were the ones who decided what land they would relinquish. Peasants were left with narrow strips of marginal land that rarely yielded enough to sustain them. Upon his return home, Tolstoy was appointed arbiter of the peace, charged with settling disputes between landowners and peasants in his area. He realized that whatever decisions he made were not likely to satisfy either side in these disputes. It was not long before the landed aristocracy had him removed from the office. Tolstoy's social conscience could not find satisfaction from any of the great thinkers of his time. In an article published in 1928 by the New York Times, his son Ilya explains what eventually changed his entire thinking. He was feverishly seeking for a solution of the land question in Russia when he ran across Henry George's Progress and Poverty. This was exactly what he was looking for. Here was a peaceful and righteous solution of the problem. Let the land belong to the nation as a whole, and give the use of it to those who work on it with their own hands. My father believed in the practical possibility of such a reform in Russia so deeply that he even wrote to some of the members of the Russian government and to the Tsar himself, advocating the abolition of land ownership and the institution of the single tax in Russia. To be fair to Henry George, he never embraced land nationalization. George had no problem with land held privately, just so long as the owners made an annual payment to the community or society equal to the full potential annual rental value of the land held. To be fair to Tolstoy, he was certain that Russia was running out of time to achieve systemic changes. Tolstoy had no faith in those who governed to take action. He saw the state as inherently destructive of human rights. Years later, responding to a correspondent's inquiry into his views of the conflict in South Africa between the Boers and the British, he explained why war would never result in progressive change. As long as we make use of privileged wealth while the mass of the people are crushed by toil, there will always be wars for markets and for gold mines, etc., which we need to maintain privileged wealth. Although Tolstoy eventually absorbed Henry George's book Progress and Poverty, his perspectives on how to solve the land question arose after reading a German or French translation of George's 1883 book Social Problems. As Tolstoy later recalled, "I have been acquainted with Henry George since the appearance of his Social Problems. I read them and was struck by the correctness of his main idea and by the unique clearness and power of his argument, which is unlike anything in scientific literature, and especially by the Christian spirit, which also stands alone in the literature of science, which pervades the book." After reading it, I turned to his previous work, Progress and Poverty, and with a heightened appreciation of its author's activity. To a Siberian peasant, Tolstoy took the time to explain what would happen if Russia adopted the plan for land reform contained in Henry George's writings. The scheme of Henry George is as follows. The advantage and profit from the use of land is not everywhere the same, since the more fertile, convenient portions adjoining populous districts will always attract many who wish to possess them. And so much the more as these portions are better and more suitable, they ought to be appraised according to their advantages. The better, dearer; the worse, cheaper; the worst, cheapest of all. What Tolstoy came to understand from reading Henry George is that the best lands yielded more output than less fertile lands, subject to the same input of labor and capital goods. This advantage could be measured in the output differences, which the political economist going back to Richard Cantillon had described as rent. Armed with the insights provided by Henry George, in 1886 Tolstoy wrote, "What then must we do?" Here he succinctly described the social conditions that doomed Russia to violent upheaval. "I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am very sorry for him and wish to ease his lot by all possible means, except by getting off his back." Nearly 3 decades after first reading George's Social Problems, Tolstoy wrote a preface to a Russian edition. If anything, his commitment to the principles embraced by Henry George had become deeper. Yet he expressed his dismay that so few others had embraced George's remedy as the path to justice. And now, 30 years have gone by since the clear, all-sided, and most fundamental explanation of this great thought, and still it remains altogether unknown to the great majority of people. To Tolstoy, the analysis presented by Henry George was rational, equitable, and nonviolent. Thus he fully expected that this reform would be widely embraced by activists and broadly implemented. In a letter to Bernhard Eulenstein, a leader of the single tax movement in Germany, he expressed his frustration that so little had happened, but also his hope and expectation that this would soon change. One would have thought that it must be as clear as day to any educated man of our time that the possession of land by people who do not cultivate it themselves, but prevent hundreds, nay thousands of starving families from access to the same, must be a state of things as immoral as the possession of slaves. But nonetheless, we see educated, refined English, Austrian, Russian, and Prussian aristocrats enjoying this cruel base privilege, based on the ready sophisms which political economy affords them, and they are not only not ashamed, but pride themselves in it. All across Europe, peasants were being forced off the land to make room for sheep and cattle. Crowded into the continent's cities, they suffered new hardships. Tolstoy continues. The merit of Henry George now lies in this, that he has dissipated into thin nothingness all these sophisms which are brought forward for the defense of property in land, so that the defenders of this already dare not discuss the question, but cautiously avoid it and pass it over in silence. But Henry George has also shaken this evasive policy, and herein lies his merit. He has not rested satisfied with bringing this question to the highest degree of clearness, so that it is only the people with closed eyes who cannot perceive the immorality of private property in land. In 1896, Tolstoy wrote to Henry George, anticipating the publication of George's book, The Science of Political Economy. I shall wait with great patience the appearance of your new book, which will contain the so much needed criticism of the orthodox political economy. The reading of every one of your books makes clear to me things which were not so before, and confirm me more and more in the truth and practicability of your system. Unfortunately, Henry George and Leo Tolstoy never met. Henry George collapsed in October of 1897, victim of a stroke during his second campaign for the office of mayor of New York City. The Science of Political Economy, with final editing by Henry George Jr., was published in 1898. When Tolstoy decided to pull his own thoughts on the land question together in The Great Iniquity, published in 1905, he knew that his own effort might fail as yet another voice crying out in the wilderness. The chief method of opposing Henry George was the method always employed against irrefutable and self-evident truths. This, which is still being applied to Henry George's teaching, was that of ignoring it. Tolstoy was visited by Henry George Jr. in 1909, who was on a worldwide tour that also took him to Japan. Ilya Tolstoy recalled the visit his father received from Henry George Jr. My father never met Henry George, but his son, Henry George Jr., made a special trip to Russia to meet him. My father was certainly very happy to know the son of the man whom he so much admired, and to hear from him of the life and activities of the great reformer. When they were parting, my father turned to Mr. George and said, "Goodbye, we will probably never meet again. I am much older than you are, and I will probably see your father in the beyond before you get there. What shall I tell him? Tell him that I am continuing his work as much as it is in my power," said Mr. George, smiling. In an article appearing in the World magazine shortly after their meeting, Henry George Jr. said of Tolstoy, "In talking with him over a great range of subjects, it was obvious that this man, with an aged, delicate body, had a soul of youth. He revealed the liveliest knowledge of what was going on over the world and made the keenest comments, drawing the general conclusion that the great struggle for the overthrow of industrial slavery in the world will end in victory, just as the chattel slavery struggle in the United States and Russia half a century ago ended." Tolstoy's youngest daughter, Alexandra, served in the Russian army during the First World War. She was imprisoned by the Bolsheviks in 1920, but was later released to serve as director of the Tolstoy Museum at Yasnaya Polyana. Alexandra escaped from the Soviet Union in 1929 and came to the United States, where she established the Tolstoy Foundation near New York City. In 1961, she spoke at the Henry George School of Social Science about her family's admiration for Henry George. In our family, Tanya, my oldest sister, was so carried away by the theory of Henry George, and when she received her estate under the will of my father, who gave away all his property, she resented somehow becoming the owner of land. So an experiment was started. The peasants worked on the land and paid a tax or rent, which was used for their needs. The peasants were very pleased with this arrangement, and it worked well as long as my sister and father were there. In 1905, Tolstoy wrote an essay titled "The One Thing Needful," in which he observed, "At present, the condition of our Christian world is this. One small portion of men possesses the great part of the land and enormous wealth, which more and more concentrate themselves in the same hands, and are being used for the maintenance of the luxurious, effeminate, unnatural life of a smaller number of families. Another and greater portion of men, deprived of the right and therefore of the possibility of freely using the land, encumbered by taxes raised on all necessary articles, and therefore crushed by unhealthy labor in factories belonging to the wealthy, live and die in dependence or in hatred toward those who, profiting by their labor, compel them to live thus." All that Tolstoy could do at this point was raise a warning one more time. At the beginning of The Great Iniquity, he wrote, "The fundamental evil from which the Russian people, as well as the peoples of Europe and America, are suffering is the fact that the majority of the people are deprived of the indisputable natural right of every man to use a portion of the land on which he was born. Until this atrocity shall cease, no political reforms will give freedom and welfare to the people. Only the emancipation of the majority of the people from that land slavery in which they now are held can render political reforms, not a plaything and a tool for personal aims in the hands of politicians, but the real expression of the will of the people." Tolstoy also used fiction to express what he believed were the virtues of Henry George's solution to the land question. His novel Resurrection, published in 1899, introduced the idea of transferring political power to local governments, which would collect the rent of land to be used to pay for public goods and services. Resurrection was heavily censored when it first appeared, and the full manuscript was not published until 1936. Interestingly, all royalties from the book were donated to a fund to assist Russian pacifists hoping to emigrate to Canada. Shortly before his death, on the 20th of November 1910, Tolstoy wrote to his daughter Sasha, who was recovering in the Crimea from a serious illness. "Once again, I am painfully oppressed by the luxury and idleness of the rich. I feel an increasing need to describe all the folly and ignominy of our lives of luxury and brutality, surrounded by starving, half-naked people being eaten alive by vermin living in chicken coops. Tolstoy's estate passed to his wife and brothers. His desire was that the land be given to the peasants. With proceeds received from the publication of Tolstoy's remaining works, his daughter Sasha bought back the estate and gave most of the land to the peasants. His wife Sonia retained the house and orchard. In 1917, the estate was converted into a state farm. Famine was already spreading across Russia. This political cartoon is a fitting conclusion to this story. Here, Tolstoy acknowledges the measure of the man, Henry George. "Sir," he says, "this marble bust commemorates the greatest American of the 19th century." Tolstoy understood by this time that hardly anyone else really cared.